Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the annual Freebairn Lecture. My name is David Dixon, and I'm Head of the Department of Economics here at the University of Melbourne. I would like to begin the evening in the customary way by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which tonight's lecture takes place. The Freebairn Annual Lecture is part of the faculty's wider programme of public lectures offered to the community. We welcome members of the public to subscribe to the mailing list, to receive invitations to attend these public lectures, or to receive recordings of the lectures once they are released. The Department of Economics and the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research have jointly run lectures on public policy for many years now. The intent of this particular lecture series is to give Australian-based economists the opportunity to discuss relevant issues of contemporary public policy. In 2012, we made the decision to rename this lecture the Freebairn Lecture in Public Policy in recognition of the many significant contributions Professor John Freebairn has made to economics and public policy. Professor Freebairn is the current Ritchie Chair in Economics. He's a former head of the Department of Economics and has also been a director of the Melbourne Institute. Professor Freebairn is one of Australia's best-known contributors on economic issues. I would now like to welcome Professor Abigail Payne, the Director and Ronald Henderson Professor at the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research, to introduce our speaker. Abigail.
Thank you, David, and welcome everybody. It is with great honor that I'd like to introduce you to Professor Beth Webster. Beth is currently the Director of the Center for Transformative Information and the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research Impact and Policy at Swinburne University. Beth received her undergraduate and master's degree from Monash and her PhD from the University of Cambridge. Her honors and affiliations include being a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences Australia, former President of the European Policy for Intellectual Property Association, former President of the Asia-Pacific Innovation Network, a council member of the Victorian branch of the Economic Society of Australia, and a council member of the Victorian Treasurers Policy Advisory Group. She also holds honorary positions at the University of Melbourne, University of Tasmania, and a lesser-known university. I think it's called Oxford University. I could tell you all about Beth's research and her academic papers, and in all the research that has gone into top journals, no less. But this lecture is about the influence of research on public policy. And just as Beth has attacked her research with energy and insight, she has done the same when it comes to influencing public policy. Beth is very good at taking complex economic topics and relating them to current issues that government and industry face. This is no easy feat when your area of study is on things like patents and innovation. So let me highlight a few of the topics on which she's provided insights. Relating the role of government funding and policy to support research and development as an important vehicle for promoting innovation. When you have private sector innovation, such as Apple inventing the iPhone, Google, it's very easy to lose sight of the importance of government funding and to forget the importance of government support for basic and applied science. Questioning the relationship between growth and the generation of new ideas. Here she challenged research that argued that productivity growth has been declining despite the increase in the number of researchers over the last several decades. She challenged assertions that we are simply running out of ideas. How might we measure impact and engagement when it comes to research and innovation? Given we live in a world of KPIs, Beth articulated why KPIs can be dangerous when trying to understand the effects of what we do for society. Some other things: questioning the value of copyright laws, discussing the role of government debt. Apropos of the government budgets that are coming out right now, Beth has very articulately explained why we should not think about government debt in the same way we might think about household debt. Now, on a personal note, although I've only interacted Beth with a few times, I have found her to be very supportive and welcoming as I made my transition from Canada to Australia. There are many in this audience that know Beth well because she is a former member of the Melbourne Institute. And I happen to have gotten some information from some of my colleagues about Beth. So what I've learned is that a big trait of hers is tolerance. While her PhD was on intangible capital, she actually came to the Institute as a labor economist and worked on matters related to immigration. But she quickly acclimated and moved into the area of industrial economics and innovation. She spent many years in the Institute helping to build the structure of the Institute and really demonstrate her importance and the relevance of the research we do at the university as it relates to Australian economic and social policy. So I'm very much looking forward to a thoughtful and engaging presentation tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Beth Webster.
So thank you very much, Abigail, for that very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be invited back to a place where I spent many happy years here at the Melbourne Institute, and indeed a place where, as Abigail's mentioned, John was director. Now, just to totally embarrass John, I'd just like to say a few words. I can't see John anywhere in the audience. So John is a remarkable economist in many respects. As those who know him will testify, John's hallmark is his no-fuss analytic insights and his ability to cut to the core of a problem. His style is very much in the tradition of moral philosophy, in that he isolates what matters most from what is secondary and then explains it very simply. And the best theorist also understands the need to verify ideas with evidence in a stepwise fashion. John is an economist par excellence on both these fronts. John is also noted for his breadth of subject matter. I first read his academic articles as an undergraduate when he wrote with Glenn Withers on youth unemployment. But his reputation lies more in the areas of agricultural economics, climate change, tax and public policy. I speak for many people when I say that John Freebairn has been a role model in both his ability to present complex ideas, to take on the big issues of the day, and to be someone who contributes without self-interest to the discipline. There are many calls on his expertise, and he largely and generously gives his time. So now, in the spirit of John's legacy, I'm going to talk about one of the big issues that has consumed the best part of my career as an economist. What makes us wealthy, and how does that magic happen? So, on reflecting on this issue, I can see that essentially I sit and push buttons all day, make black marks on a piece of paper, talk to people on the phone, yet somehow I contribute to an economy that provides goods and services and life comforts that are beyond the dreams of even my most recent ancestors. I have more clothes than I could possibly wear in a year. I have very complex and varied foods on demand. I have entertainments and sophisticated pleasure goods that would have been unimaginable to even my grandmother. And I look forward to a long life and expect all my children to reach adulthood and reproduce. Yet on most measures, albeit subjective, my work is a lot easier and more pleasant than the typical job at any point in our history. Our ancestors worked considerably harder than most of us, but had limited food and clothing and shelter, often within the envelope of a very short and painful life. So how do we account for the difference between then and now? It's not the growth just in plant, equipment and infrastructure, or what economists call capital accumulation. Capital is just a transformation of matter, and the amount of matter in the world does not change over time. If we think about the world being one large vertically integrated firm, plant and equipment and infrastructure are just intermediate inputs. So what then governs this transformation? That is, what determines growth? Francis Bacon said half a millennium ago that people do not create material things, they only create ideas. Knowledge is the only original factor of production that actually truly accumulates, and is therefore the only factor that can cause a continual growth in output per worker. So growth in the economy is not just about capital accumulation. Perhaps it's about ideas embodied in new capital equipment, but capital accumulation on its own will hit diminishing and then negative returns very quickly. If we just keep investing in the same equipment that is homogenous year in year after year, our economy will not grow. But talk of education suddenly makes one think of education. But is it the whole story? So I have here data on the average education level and income per capita of two countries, Korea and Germany. This is just an illustration. They're approximately the same population, geographic size and endowment of natural resources. What is shown here is that at every level of average schooling, which is along the x-axis, German income per capita along the y-axis is considerably above that for Korea. And I'll put the dates of the different points along the chart. In the 1970s and 1980s, Germany certainly had more plant and equipment and infrastructure per capita than Korea. And this may explain some of the gap. But by 2010, the stock of these capital goods per person was about the same. Yet the gap in per capita income is large. Now, this point is not new. Whereas the earlier econometric studies typically found that only 15 to 20% of production, that's goods and services that we can consume, can be explained by plant, equipment and labour. The new ones based on these new data sets, employer-employee data sets that account for different skill levels, only get to about 40%. So this leaves still 60% unexplained. Now this gap has not gone unnoticed by the various disciplines. Accounting, management, sociology, law, psychology. They study this gap in their own way and have their own terminology. They call it culture, tacit knowledge, institutions, systems, network, intangible capital. And although they don't discuss these factors in the context of a production function, there is a considerable literature in their disciplines on this topic. Now, economics has always prided itself on pinpointing invisible forces. Recall what Adam Smith did with the price system. That was our great revelation. But to date, the mainstream has been relatively slow on recognising that this gap is not simply a measurement residual. The idea that simple measures of labour and capital do not fully explain sales is obvious to the man in the street. If you ask the average person to consider two businesses employing the same number of equivalently educated people and using the same equipment, and then ask them, will they be equally profitable or will they have the same sales? They will tell you, of course not. It matters where the business is positioned, how well the business is managed, the acumen and vision of the leader, whether they're producing what the market wants, and how well they reach their customers. Yet economists have been slow to move beyond the labour capital model of the economy. We often get so sidetracked with the beauty of our abstract models that we actually take them literally. So putting that aside, I'd now like to turn your attention to thinking about how the world has advanced useful ideas and how we have got to where we are today. Economic historians have many theories, but I would like to distill them into three factors: what I'll call complementary inputs, investor confidence, and knowing about knowing. The first is the existence of complementary inputs. To progress an idea and make it workable, you often need other ideas at the same time. Now, history is littered with examples of ideas that were ahead of their time in the sense that other necessary complementary ingredients did not exist. Think of the wheel. Let's start with basics. The wheel was simultaneously invented in several civilisations, but it proved unworkable as a mode of transport without metallurgy. The wood frames simply fell apart. In the mid-19th century, Charles Babbage invented a mechanical computer, but this never took off. It was held back by the absence of standardised electricity and the technical input from solid-state physics, the guys who invented transistors. Erasmus Darwin, who was the grandfather of Charles, had an early theory of the evolution of the species. However, because he did not know that the universe was billions of years old, and this was later discovered by astronomers Caroline and William Herschel, and because he did not have Thomas Malthus's idea about how populations can outstrip their food supply, he did not clinch the theory of natural selection as his grandson did. Likewise, the vacuum cleaner, washing machine and dishwasher were all invented in the mid-19th century, but failed commercially for lack of running water and electricity supplies into households. Penicillin was invented in 1928, but it was never going to scale up, which it did during World War II, to an industrial level without the contributed ideas and techniques from about 30 different pharma companies in the United States, led by Howard Florey of Melbourne University ilk. The cheapening of electricity made products such as aluminium and fertiliser cost effective. Now, on a more contemporary note, sharing platforms such as Airbnb, Uber and eBay did not become ubiquitous until the internet. The idea of exchange platforms have existed before the internet, but they were never scaled up. These are really just examples to illustrate how you need to coordinate ideas, complementary ideas, both across space and across time. Otherwise, the ideas will not work in an incomplete setting. So the second factor I think we need to get from where we were to where we are now is investor confidence. It's basically all about resources. Investors and champions of innovation routinely complain about the shortage of funds. There is no shortage of reports that will tell you they had a great idea, but they couldn't invest because no one would lend them the money or invest. A closer inspection of this situation shows that the investors favour areas where they know and understand the industry, the market and the technology. Japanese bankers understand robots and cars. The German bankers understand chemicals. Australian stock market analysts understand high-risk mining, and the New Zealand bankers understand dairy and livestock markets. Investment advisors can read a perspective in their niche. They talk to people in their industry, they can read between the lines, and they've seen so many specific one-off cases that before that they can make reasonably intuitive decisions about a new prospect. History, experience and dense networks and internet connections between relevant people can reduce the hesitancy of investors to part with their cash. So the third factor is what I will call knowing about knowing. By this I mean that to improve you have to learn and inquire, and you have to change. Knowing is not doing. But doing means adopting new ways of behaving, and this generally involves dispensing with old ways. And this can be very hard to do. Some societies are more receptive to new ideas and readily embrace new modes of behaviour. They intuitively understand the value of testing ideas and re-evaluating accepted ways and notions. It's a deep cultural attitude. Sometimes core competencies can become core rigidities that prevent firms from recognising that they need to change. Famous examples here include the BlackBerry, Kodak, Nokia and Polaroid. Firms can become unable to see that the knowledge architecture on which their platform systems are based has shifted. Part of the problem lies here in separating transient fashions from discontinuities. Alfred Whitehead, an early 20th century UK philosopher, said that the biggest invention in his time was the invention of invention. Business have come in that late 19th century going forward to understand that knowledge can be manipulated and bent to our will. We don't have to rely on serendipity. So where does this put us today? It's easy to see these changes and reflect looking backwards, especially if you go back that far, but it's very hard to then extrapolate and say, well, what should we do today going forward? There's a wealth of empirical studies that show positive links between measures of knowledge creation, such as patents or R&D, imperfect measures as they are, and the growth of firms, industries and countries. On the basis of this economic research, many jurisdictions have set formal and informal targets. So the EU, the European Union, has set a target that R&D should be 3% of GDP by 2020. In Korea, it's 5%. China has set sharp incentives for patents, and most countries have incentive schemes for R&D, Australia included. And these policies have worked. R&D as a percentage of the workforce across the developed world has increased considerably. However, this is not translated into an acceleration in our standard of living. If anything, depends where you want to draw the trend line, we're decelerating. So as a measure of our rise in standard of living, what I have here is the growth in consumption per working hour. I don't use GDP because that involves double counting. It's gross, it double counts investment. And of course, on the denominator, I only have working hours because over the long run, plant and equipment is an intermediate input. So the idea behind pursuing an increase in R&D per workforce is that it should shift up that yellow curve. So the yellow curve is a growth rate, it's a percentage growth rate over time. It's above zero, so we are still growing, but we should be growing at a faster rate, that is accelerating, and we're not. So it appears that in aggregate, the simple target or indicator-based incentives are not working. That knowledge, in the broader sense, is a source of improvement in our well-being hardly needs further argument. But it appears that new knowledge is not converting into valued use. The pipeline of ideas is burgeoning in the upstream sections, but not flowing down. So what needs to be done? We've discussed how we got to here, but now I'd like to talk about how we might move forward. How can we convert this sizable rise in R&D into a higher standard of living? And I want to argue that we need to place more emphasis on 4 factors. The first one, which I've called triangulate information, is talking about taking the risk out of the development of new ideas. Better networks, institutions and connections between market players should allow developers to cross-check information and acquire the confidence that here is an idea with high potential. And this confidence should flow through to investors. The more uncertain is the investment, and R&D is highly uncertain, the more critical is the web of interconnecting parties for delivering triangulated bits of information. Triangulation is when you have several pieces of independent information that cross-check and allow you to confirm that yes, this technology is new, yes, this technology has not been done elsewhere in the world, yes, there is a market for this technology. So this confirmation is needed to assure all parties down the value chain that they have a potential product or process that is valuable. Isolated individuals, firms and investments have a limited basis on which to collate and judge the meaning of fast-moving information. And as knowledge and information become more complex and dispersed, it's not possible for a single firm to keep up with and exploit all the relevant data. Here, local clusters can play a role. They absorb external information, slice up the knowledge and reinterpret it. The cluster can then economically support the actions of its members by providing specialist intermediate services. I believe investors will be much more likely to lend to parties who can demonstrate that they have solid evidence about what is happening in their technological and consumer environments. Couple this with trust, the second factor, and you have a natural way to minimise opportunistic behaviour by collaborators. It's never possible to include all contingencies in a written contract, especially when you're trading frontier, new-to-the-world ideas that are not yet codified. Trust between collaborators or buyers and sellers can reduce the worry that the other party will take an advantage of an unexpected event or misunderstanding. And one of the oldest ways to engender trust is to establish long-term relationships. However, the successful development of a new-to-the-world idea on its own does little to raise our standard of living. Ideas need to spread and to be taken up by all relevant parties. That is, we need copying and imitation. Hence, the third factor we need is to encourage the spread of ideas. Copying is an important driver of productivity growth. If one firm has the great idea and other firms don't follow, then it's going to have very limited effect on economic growth. It's well known that there's a wide dispersion in productivity between firms in the same industry, and that there is a long tail of badly managed and low productivity firms. Competition does simply not weed these folk out in the ruthless and efficient way economic textbooks suggest. Unions, employers, and employer associations and industry departments may all play a role here in promoting peer-to-peer learning. Our literature suggests that even if managers know they're well behind the frontier, they do not necessarily know how to go about making a step change. And finally, as an economist, I can't help myself talking about the role of public policy. I've suggested a role for unions and employer associations, and I should add here professional associations too. But governments have the power and the big money, and we all default to giving them helpful advice on what to do. Now, Australian industry policy is plagued by a multitude of short-lived programs that change names and personnel almost as often as ministers. Furthermore, Australia has one of the lowest levels of government spending on industry improvement in the OECD. Our research has shown that most businesses are not aware of these programs, and this makes the funding pool susceptible to frequent flyers and businesses that are skilled at accessing public support. It's excellent to see the establishment of translation funds in public research organisations. The plans by the federal government for the Medical Research Future Fund and Defence's Next Generation Technology Fund are welcome. I hope that the recommendation by Alan Finkel and Bill Ferris and their colleagues for a dedicated translation fund is adopted in the forthcoming budget. However, I have seen too many good initiatives come and go to be confident that these programs will be enough. What happens if there is a change of government and the next minister wants to put their stamp on policy? So I would recommend that any precinct or growth centre or large funding pool for translation research be established under an Act of Parliament. This is one of the best features of the Rural Research and Development Corporation. The legislation means it's very hard to change programs in both content and name, and that it gives enough permanence to the people running the organisations and the firms they serve to plan for the future, to become familiar with what is on offer, and to reduce transaction costs. So, colleagues and friends, I leave these thoughts with you in the hope that Australia will not only adopt a bipartisan climate change policy, but a bipartisan industrial development strategy as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Beth, for a very interesting presentation. We've got plenty of time for questions. So we have 2 roving microphones. So if you raise your hand if you have a question and wait until the microphone arrives with you. Okay, so we'll start here. And could you identify yourself, please?
Ed Boy Party. My question is about the fact that as economies and individuals grow, they don't need to, they're unwilling to, and unable to make sacrifices required to sustain that growth. As one example, you mentioned about peer-to-peer learning. One of the reasons why it doesn't happen, copying among businesses, is because the numerous regulatory barriers which prevent new companies starting up. And the barriers come up as society becomes affluent. They want those regulations, and that prevents new companies starting up and copying, for example. That's as one example. Would you like to comment on that, please?
Well, everyone's against bad regulations, but they're for good regulations. I mean, what can I say? I mean, I think with respect to regulation, we decide what society or economy we want to live in, and then we decide how we want to achieve that. Now, that may be through having no regulations or little regulations or a lot, or we may use the market, or we may use, government fiat or what have you. But without giving me an example of what regulations you're talking about, it's very hard to make a comment. Obviously, you need some regulations because there are externalities, there are effects of what business do on third parties that you want to diminish. You need ethical standards, as we find on the news currently. It's very, you'd have to make a better case for saying that too many regulations are stopping startups. I think just on the point on startups, there is a lot of hype around startups. The evidence, and very little evidence in Australia on how much they do contribute to the national economy. But in America, most startups are low wage, low growth, and never get beyond 3 or 4 people. The owner, their spouse, and a couple of kids, and they fold when the owner retires. So, I think some economies, startups are very important, but in other economies, they're not important at all. You can grow in many different ways, and I don't think startups are a panacea.
Hi, Helen Dorset, Defence Innovation Network, New South Wales. I'm an Associate Director. I really like your idea about legislating support. Do you have any guidance on how we might work together to get that sort of action in place?
Should I talk? Yeah. Okay. So the R&D, go back. The R&D corporations were set up essentially after World War II, and they were reacting to the particular structure of the primary sector industry, which is a whole lot of small firms that didn't have scale to do their own R&D. So it's a matched farm or agricultural producer to government model, so government does put in quite a bit. But the thing about this model, it's like the NHMRC or the ARC, because they've been around for so long, everyone knows they're there, they know the rules, they know how to react to it, they know how to not work the system in a opportunistic way, but they know how to use it to their best advantage. The other thing about setting them up under an Act of Parliament means it's just too much work for the parliamentarians to abolish it, so it just keeps going. And they can change the structure of the R&D corporation, but the entity itself and that funding model itself will stay and will continue until something really, really bad happens and it becomes at the top of the pile for the parliamentarians to get rid of it. One of the big advantages of the R&D corporations is that they have an inbuilt translation mechanism or extension mechanism is what they call it. So not only does industry determine what the research is done with the money, the funds they have, and they largely outsource it, I think, to universities or CSIRO. But once the technology comes back to them, then they have, and this has been whittled away over the years, but they used to have an inbuilt extension program where people actually took the ideas out to the farmer, to the farm gate, and told them about it, because they're SMEs and they're really too small to really keep up with a lot of things that's going on. So that whole R&D model, and some of them work better than others, but the whole R&D model is quite remarkable, really.
Oh, hi. I was wondering if I was thinking about the cooperative research centres and whether you see that fitting into your picture. In some ways, they've been going quite a long time. They've got bipartisan support. To some extent, you could say they triangulate the information, and they try to create a kind of a group of a kind of peer-to-peer learning situation.
So the CRCs, the Cooperative Research Centres, have been going on for a long time. And I think maybe because they have got bipartisan support. I'm not sure if they're established under an Act of Parliament. Do you know, David? Yeah, don't know. Anecdotally, a lot of them are quite successful. I would like to see them actually being evaluated on a more systematic basis. So actually, because now they've been going, 2-3 decades. Now we probably have enough data points to actually say, for the money we put in, which is a few $100 million every year, what has been the eventual outcome? Because we do hear about the big headline inventions, but a bit of hard evaluation around them would be good. But yeah, they're a great model. The R&D corporations differ from them in that the CRCs are really heavily based around universities, and the money very heavily is directed by the university sector. I know that is shifting a bit, but the R&D corporations are very heavily governed and directed by industry.
Brad Rooting, if you have a big industry policy backed by legislation, how do you make sure that you're not throwing good money after bad ideas?
I think you should evaluate it, and you reassess it. I mean, I think that is one of the problems with the R&D corporations, in that some of the unsuccessful ones, and this is just, again, anecdotal, because I don't believe they have properly been evaluated in a systematic, quantitative way. But I think with evaluation, with scrutiny, and with the involvement of the parties who should benefit from it, I think that's probably the best way to maintain the integrity of it.
Marcus Wigan. The question I'd like to pose to you, with your special experience in intellectual property and in innovation, is intellectual property proving to be a gain or a drag? There have been arguments in both directions, and I think it's extremely important for innovation and development.
So what this speaker is referring to is that, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, there's a lot of strategic game playing going on within the patent system. So they call patents a sport of kings because it's incredibly expensive to get a patent. You're talking about hundreds of thousands, especially if you want to get an international patent. Now, a lot of large multinationals take out so many patents, they'll take out a pile of patents that thick, millions of dollars, to really go and frighten off people from doing R&D or doing high-tech work in their particular patch. So that's a sort of thing, process that's been documented around particularly North America and parts of Europe. And there is fairly good evidence that that does go on in some industries. I'm not sure, we have, through work in Australia, I'm not sure if we've really uncovered any of that game playing going on, particularly in Australia. But that's just one negative aspect of the patent system. I think I would always describe the international patent system as being really a bit Dickensian. It's sort of been in the thrall of a lot of process and paperwork, and a lot of systems of examination and enforcement that sort of really is sort of way out of date, given what we know about how you should enforce regulations. So I think it probably can be improved. Now, whether on balance it's doing more harm than good is very hard to know. I suspect in the highly codified sciences like pharmaceuticals, chemicals, some areas of engineering, it probably does good in the sense that it does give protection to people who are very easily reverse engineered. In the other areas where it is sometimes used as a smoke screen, really, to frighten people off. Maybe that's not. But it's very hard to have a patent system that only applies in one technology and not another. So yeah, I don't have all the answers here, but I do think, there are things you can do to the process of applying, examining, granting and enforcing patents that would bring it into the 21st century. Yep.
G'day, Rod Glover from Monash University. Beth, you've spoken about the chopping and changing of policy with a change of government. I guess I'd add to that, with a change of minister. We've had 5 innovation ministers in 5 years. Is it time we bite the bullet and have an independent national innovation institution?
Yes. I mean, and one that has some sort of legislative permanence to it, I would add. I mean, there's lots of things we don't allow politicians to do. We don't allow them to set ethical standards or to interfere with the judiciary or to interfere with the Constitution. But maybe this is one area where we should ask them to pull back as well.
My name is Jeff Edwards. I worked at La Trobe University and a long time ago for a little while at Melbourne University. One of my pieces of good fortune in life, John, this will embarrass you, was to work for quite a time with John. Here's one thing I'll say about John. John always carried a bigger load than almost anyone else, and I don't remember John ever complaining about the load he was carrying. Beth, as I drove here tonight, I heard an interview with the Bangladeshi economist who won the Nobel Peace Award for his contribution to tiny banks that make tiny loans, largely to women. One thing he said was that we don't need to have unemployment. If the people who are unemployed turn themselves to entrepreneurial activities, they can cease being unemployed employees to employed entrepreneurs. Now, in some ways, it seems sort of crazy, unbelievable, but I invite you to comment on this, if you wish, in the Australian context.
So, thanks to Keynes in, 1936, we have the mechanism to promote increased employment through government policy, but we don't necessarily have the ability to do that at the same productivity level as what we experience today. So one of the issues with a lot of these programs to create employment, to create jobs, is to create high value jobs or high productivity jobs. So I think you need, whether it's self-employment or an existing enterprise and taking on more people, you need to have both the supply and the demand side working together.
Just referring to the Global Innovation Index, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, which is out just recently, but interesting how Australia has fallen down on that index as far as innovation is concerned. We're good input, but we're bad at output. So some of the things, I was just doing a bit of search then, so some of the things that came out was university industry cooperation was poor, relatively. Our clusters weren't as good as what they should be. Software spending to GDP, interesting type of ratio, wasn't very good. And in particular, kind of some of our VC funding wasn't that great. So I was just wondering if you could just comment. There's a lot of issues there, but just comment on the index and some of those points that I brought up there.
So I'm familiar with the index, but I didn't know the one that came out recently. So a lot of these are about the either the unwillingness or lack of knowingness of industry to engage with universities. I suspect a lot of universities are pretty keen to engage with industry, although on their own terms. So there's a bit that can be done on the university side to employ academics who want to engage with industry and have aligned interests with industry, not just take their money and do what they want to do anyway. But also I know a lot of industry will tell me that first of all, they're unsure of what universities do in a sense that can help them day to day. But secondly, they don't know how to approach a university. There is no sort of front door. It's not like walking into a shop and you walk in and someone comes up and asks you what you want. They can ring up a switchboard, they can get the runaround, they can ring up a specific academic and no one picks up the phone or they don't answer back. There is actually no I guess front door is the word, no way in which somebody who can't articulate what they want in an academic terminology, which is what the academics understand, someone from industry can't walk into a university and find out what they don't know, or what they know they think they know but isn't so. So I think there's a fair bit that can be done there in that soft connection between the two sectors.
My name's Patrick Westman. Beth, if we do get your model right and we are able to create a situation in which Australia is able to properly translate innovation through to results, what kind of flow-through effect would that have on growth?
Assuming we're measuring output properly, and you know, there's quibbles around that, it should increase the rate of increase in growth. Increase, you know, instead of we're down, what are we down at? You know, we're down at 1%, that's 2004, that's a bit old. And this is 19 countries, not just Australia. But it should raise it up to maybe the trend level, which is probably about 2%. But when you talk about growth, it's very easy to think in terms of you know, more yachts and cars and goods that we probably don't really need. But growth is a lot about maybe it's climate change policies, maybe it's helping the mentally ill, maybe it's stopping, you know, children from dying of cancer at a young age. There's a lot to do. Maybe it's, you know, poverty, homelessness. There's a lot that we can do if we do grow faster. So.
Jerry Korvasanis, Federation University Australia. I'd like to follow up the previous two questions and ask two quick questions. The previous question, not this one, but the preceding one, seemed to me to look at the bits, and there was a lot of discussion about legislating, and everybody wants to go to policy, but it seems that, to me, it's the first 3 points that you raised that need to build the index of innovation up in Australia, i.e. we need a strong innovation system. Our system is broke, it doesn't exist, and in other parts it's put together with Band-Aids. So unless, and it's my question, unless those three long-term relation, triangulation, information, peer-to-peer is all actually systematised together, forget about legislative support, because you'll be legislating a system that's broke. So my first question. And the second, why grow? What are we talking about? If we try to improve the health and the education and the climate change, we may not want to grow as fast as we're going currently, because growing has actually created a lot of the problems. So why is the focus on the word growth? Why can't we innovate so that we have a better society and stop focusing on the word growth?
Okay, so Australia's actually quite good at innovating in certain areas. We're pretty good in certain agricultural products, and we're pretty good in certain parts of mining. Recall, I think we led the way in self-driving vehicles, you know, so don't think we're totally hopeless across the board.
The statistics show it, we're 26th on the OECD.
Yeah, but those data are across all industries to start with. It doesn't mean we're terrible everywhere.
The extension agricultural people have been expanded, they don't exist anymore.
But I think what we need to do is to say, okay, we can't rely anymore on this very narrow platform of very highly efficient industries, and we need to branch out a bit more. So I think 14% of our exports is thermal coal. Now, that's going to probably go to zero really quickly, and we really need, and you know, if China turns around and says, okay, thank you, we'll educate all our young people at home, our third largest export education goes, we need to be more flexible and agile and have other industries that we can grow. So there is a burning platform, especially when you think that it takes 30 to 40 years for these industries really to get up to world standard. You know, how long did it take us to become fantastic at mining? lots of countries have minerals in the ground, but I think maybe people go back to the gold rush in the 1850s, but it took us a long time to build up that whole network of supporting institutions around mining, the skills, the education institutions, the R&D, the finance, the logistics, the government support. It took us, decades to build that up and to become a world-class miner. Ditto with agriculture. And so we're not caught short when China suddenly rolls over and says, okay, I'm not going to take your dirty plastic anymore, or I'm not going to send our students overseas anymore. And by the way, we've got windmills and solar panels. We don't want your thermal coal. We need to really start now. So there is a burning platform. People just can't see it. What's his second point about? Oh, growth. Growth is not just about goods. Growth is about services as well. 70% of GDP is now services. And by services, I mean it could be medical research, it could be old age care, it could be something to allow older people to live in their homes longer and not have to go to a nursing home, or it could be, lots of things. Youth homelessness, getting people. So growth is what we want to grow. It's not what we have grown.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end. I'm going to take 3 more questions. So 1, 2, and then the lady at the very back.
Thank you. My name's Mary Voice. My question relates to your pillar up in the right-hand corner there, the long-term relationships and trust. Over the longer term, is long-term relationship and trust stable or declining in Australia and maybe also in America? And do you have any idea whether it is different in a place like China? Is long-term relationship and trust fundamentally different in China than, say, what's happening in Australia and the United States?
So I'm not going to answer your question because I'm not a sociologist and I'd just be making things up. But what I do know is that increasingly Australia's trade and the world trade is becoming involved in global value chains. And so what it means is that we produce parts and components that go into products, that go into someone else's products and eventually end up in a finished product. And that's increasing. I don't think Australia's increasing at the rate at which the world's increasing. But to do that, to participate fully in those global value chains, you do need the long-term relationships and you do need trust. So I don't know if it's getting better or worse, but it's becoming more important.
Thank you. Janice Cheng, urological surgeon here in Melbourne. My question is mainly regarding the bottom right now, the legislative support. Especially interested in hearing your thoughts about how you think legislative directions can come from the grassroots up. So specifically, one of the areas I'm looking into with great interest is the Medical Research Futures Fund that you mentioned before, because previously with NHMRC, only ones that have proven track records or actually marry up to what the topic of the day is would have any chance of getting any funding to then move forward, whereas the new one seems to have more of an inclination to support those of translational research. So could you comment on those, please?
Look, I don't know enough about the details of the programs to comment how they were created and how you could change it. Obviously through the political process, but not everyone has access to the ear of the minister would be one. I guess my point was more that if they look good, we think we need them, let's make them permanent. And then if they start becoming irrelevant or they need fixing up on the inside, fix it up, but keep the whole concept going forward. So, the question you're asking about how do we influence the political process that affects the whole innovation strategy.
Appreciate what is needed that was seen from the grassroots.
From the grassroots. I think, look, if you've got ideas, I don't know, come and tell me.
That would be great.
Okay, final question.
Hi, thanks, Beth, for your talk. My name's Elizabeth Ozanne from this university. Ernst & Young have a report out today on the future of the university. And one of the things they've emphasised in that is the need for greater integration of vocational education with higher education, as is the model in Germany and France and other places in Europe. I wonder, sitting as you are now at Swinburne, what you think are the possible innovative sources that might come from a changed relationship there in the future?
So I assume here you're talking about the trades when you say vocational education, because of course accountancy, law and medicine are all vocations and they're all heavily embodied in the university. I think universities have been reaching down into more practical levels by a lot of courses being having work integrated learning attached to their degrees. Again, you know, I don't know if that's a great idea. You really need, you know, it sounds good in theory, but you really need to have some sort of evaluation to see whether students who did an internship or a placement or work integrated learning, call it what you want, had a better A, initial employment outcome and B, a long-term outcome. You know, so there are educational theorists who say, okay, higher education is for the higher learning and you get your practical skills on the job and it shouldn't be part of your degree, that's what I'm saying. Although obviously, as I mentioned before, law, medicine, accounting are vocations and they often have work experience built into it. The other route you're talking about coming up from the TAFE sector into the universities, what did you have in mind or what did Ernst & Young have in mind there?
Well, there's a lot more integration in innovation in Europe and Germany. We had a recent, in terms of a much closer connection leading to innovation.
So some of those European countries, in their trade training courses, they have a master level training program as well. So it's not just a journeyman's training, that 3 years that we get here, but it goes through to you become a master plumber or a master builder or something like that. And I understand in those courses they do teach more about the business of innovation. So if a tradesman has a great idea and wants to commercialise it or scale it up, they have been taught the ways in which you go about getting the finance and getting the inputs together and marketing and distribution and things like that. So I think there was somebody, Carolyn Bourne, who for many years, a few decades back, was trying really hard to get the state government to build in a master level training course into what we call the vocational trades with no success. But yeah, I mean, maybe it could work, I don't know.
Okay, so I'm going to draw things to a close. Thank you again,
Pleasure.
Beth, for a stimulating lecture and for taking so many questions. And I have a small token of our appreciation. So thank you very much.